I'm Dr. Tim Flannery and I'm Chief Counsellor at the Australian Climate Council.
Well, thanks for joining us, Tim. Perhaps we could start with you summarising where is the world at in terms of climate change now?
Look, sadly, we're in a worse place than I would have hoped a decade ago. We're currently, the average global temperature is about 1.2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. And all of the major projection work that's done globally show that we'll reach 1.5 in the early 2030s. It's clear that we cannot avoid reaching 1.5 degrees. In fact, the latest research suggests that even with the strongest efforts we could make, we probably will peak temperatures at between 1.8 and 1.9 degrees above the pre-industrial average, which really does threaten a whole series of tipping points in Earth's climate system that act as positive feedback loops and could send the temperature far higher. So we are in a position of great risk at the moment, and the time for action to minimise that risk really is now. You know, a decade from now, what we do won't be as impactful.
In your talks, you mention a really frightening figure. That's the amount of carbon that's been emitted into the atmosphere since COP15. That's only 13 years ago. Can you expand on that?
Well, look, I was pretty active during COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. We were desperate to get agreement there because that was the last time we could see when we could have a gentle, economically painless glide path through to a 1.5 degree peak. That was 13 years ago. About 1/3 of all greenhouse gases ever emitted by our species have been emitted in those 13 years. And that means that now the peak we're coming down from is so high, getting emissions down is almost like falling off a cliff rather than a gentle glide path. To make matters worse, the greenhouse gases are very long-lived, particularly CO2. It'll stay for a century in the atmosphere after it's emitted. It also reaches what's called its full warming potential about 20 years after it's emitted. So that means that the CO2 we emit today will have its full impact 20 years from now. So there's a sort of delayed reaction, if you want. And all of that makes it more difficult to deal with this very hard to deal with greenhouse gas. You know, the great hope really is that we'll develop some drawdown approaches and pathways that let us get some of the gas out of the air. But, you know, and that includes forestry. But at the moment, those are distant prospects really at the scale we require.
So what role could forests play in that drawdown?
There's no silver bullets in this. There's no one approach that's going to draw all of the CO2 out of the air that we'll need. But as Al Gore calls it, there's plenty of silver buckshot. There's plenty of smaller things which will make a difference. And forestry is one of those. But what we need in a forestry solution is long-term carbon storage. And that's because the greenhouse gases we create by burning fossil fuels come out of an ancient store of carbon. So the coal or oil, you know, the last time the CO2 in that was free in the atmosphere was 200 or 300 million years ago. So we need solutions that won't just keep the gas out of the air for 50 years or 100 years, but 1,000 years or more in order to kind of give us the realistic drawdown that we require. One of the best ways that we can do that in forestry is by using the potential of what is called the moist temperate forests of the world. So those forests store more carbon than any other forest system by quite a considerable way. And New Zealand's very fortunate in it's got a lot of those moist temperate forests. So they're a very powerful engine for drawing large amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere and storing them permanently in growing temperate forests.
Why are moist temperate forests so good at drawing down carbon?
Look, the moist temperate forests of the world are great sequesterers of carbon for a couple of reasons. One is they are full of gigantic, slow-growing trees that live for a long time. So some of the forest giants in New Zealand can be thousands of years old. So it's carbon that's been locked up for a long time. Because they are they're in the temperate regions, they also the timber doesn't rot very quickly, so the timber will fall to the forest floor and bits and pieces and sit there for a long time. In the tropics, that sort of wood and leaf matter turns over very quickly because it's really hot and humid and decomposition occurs very quickly. The fact that the forests are moist means that they're not subject to burning. And a lot of the world's forests, they are prone to burning. The pine forests of the world are a good example of that. And, when they burn, that carbon that they've sequestered is released back into the atmosphere. So there's a number of characteristics that make those moist, temperate forests absolutely number one in terms of drawdown and long-term sequestration of carbon.
So we're struggling with the process of getting there, right? But biodiversity credits have been brought up quite often, and you've had some experience with those in Australia. Could you tell us how they work and what would you do better if you did it again?
Yeah. Look, even in Australia, the idea of biodiversity credits is fairly new. Probably the longest running scheme that I've been involved with is the Queensland Restoration Fund, where we buy what are called ACCUs off farmers. They're Australian carbon credit units. We buy those, but we pay an enhanced price for ACCUs that give a co-benefit of protecting the Great Barrier Reef or protecting biodiversity or endangered species. So one example of that might be a farmer who proposes to reforest the margins of waterways running through his property, which would stop silt and things getting into the waterway and then reaching the barrier reef, silt and other pollutants. So if we get a proposal like that, we're willing to pay a lot more for that than just for standard carbon credits. So it's become quite a targeted scheme. So it's kind of carbon credits with benefits, but the benefits are increasingly important, I think, in that scheme because we're seeing that we're delivering real abatement to these serious problems like the destruction of the barrier reef and the loss of endangered species. There are probably a million ways you could do this, but that's the way that's evolved in Queensland. What will happen in Australia federally, we're yet to find out. It could take a very different direction. I just don't know at this stage.
One of the things you've said is you think that offsetting as an idea is on its way out, it's losing credibility, but will that be replaced with these kind of nature-based incentives?
It's very interesting to watch what's happening globally in terms of biodiversity protection. A number of corporations now, particularly in Europe, are looking at how they can develop a series of protocols and approaches that make sure that their product chain doesn't include the destruction of nature and the destruction of biodiversity. So these mechanisms and ways of thinking are still fairly recent, but when you see them developing in government and non-government sectors together, you see that there's something quite serious coming together. And the world is slowing its deforestation, a bit haltingly, admittedly, but we are slowing that. We're seeing the recovery of some endangered species that have been protected in the past, like the whales. So we're seeing success in some of these areas. And I think this is the very early days of what will be a large movement. We are now in a real transition in terms of the way we feed ourselves. So humanity's been moving down the food chains ever since we killed the last woolly mammoth. We used to be big game hunters. We then became farmers. The farm system itself has proved to be leaky and damaging to the environment. So people are now moving beyond the farm system. And there's some great things happening in Europe. In Finland, there's a company called Solar Foods that are producing very high quality protein using bacteria, a very peculiar bacteria that grows rapidly and feeds on hydrogen. There are other people who are looking at developing cell lines for meat production. There are other groups that are looking at producing starches and so forth in very innovative ways. So I think we're going to keep moving down that food chain, and probably 80 years, 100 years from now, which isn't very long in the life of a forest, a significant proportion of our food may be being grown in steel vats in our cities, right? And then we'll have farmland. The question will be, what will we do with this land? How will we restore it? Europe's already facing that situation. In the next 10 years or so, 20 million hectares of farmland in Europe will go out of production because people are moving away from the margins and towards the centre. That land is up for grabs. So people who are interested in rewilding, for example, are looking at how they might use that land to bring back some of Europe's megafauna. So we're in a period of fascinating change at the moment. No one can see where it's going to end, but I think it's a very, very interesting transition that puts the focus on forestry and what we do with forest land in a very different light. You know, if you see those longer term trends, you can say, well, maybe we should get ahead of the game and start looking at how we encourage native forests to grow over the landscape and perhaps use some of that as well in time to come. But it's a long-term project, isn't it? When you've got an organism that lives 1,000 years, you know, you've got to think long-term.
As someone at the kind of forefront of leadership, how do you maintain hope? How do you keep motivation? You've got kids, or I think you have a daughter. What do you tell her?
Look, my life in the climate space is really, the best analogy I can draw is like a game of rugby. You know, it's a deadly serious game, this one, because our futures are at stake. But, you know, here we are, we've got possession of the ball, we're facing the wall of opponents, and you know they'll do anything to put you off. They'll trip you up, there'll be the neck-high tackle, there'll be anything goes. But the one thing I know is that I've got to hold on to that ball and cross that try line, you know. And so my life's all about doing that at the moment. So I don't have a lot of time to reflect on my own state of mind mentally. I'm still deep in that game trying to do the right thing. And I find it very difficult to talk to young people about because I see the sense of hopelessness rising up in that generation and despair. And that is a very toxic thing. I don't want to encourage that. And some of them are probably just a bit too young to get into that, right into the battle where I am with this stuff. So I think we've got to cut our young people a bit of slack. We've got to, you know, do the right thing. And they, you know, young people are great at seeing adults as they really are. You know, the whole idea of do as I say, not do as I do, they get that instantly, right? So if we say things and we're not walking the talk, then they see through that. They lose their respect very quickly. So it's up to us, I think, to start doing the right thing and giving them some hope.
Dealing with this crisis is in the here and now, but a green economy is actually quite a cool place to be, isn't it? It's a healthier place to be. It's better for us. It's actually probably quite prosperous. What does a green economy, a sustainable economy, look like?
My sense is that as we move into a green economy, not only will we be more prosperous because we'll have cheaper, cleaner energy, but it will have a direct impact upon our political systems and our social and economic systems, all for the better, because it will empower the individual. So the future that I see is a fantastic future for humanity. I think it's going to be wonderful, much, much better than it is today. But the transition is hard because in this game of rugby that we're playing, there's no umpire and anything goes. So at the moment, it is very tough to be on the front line of this transition. But I'm absolutely confident we'll win because the alternative is just unthinkable.